I just want to say I was making this video, and Brother Windwalk had the nerve to call my wife through a group chat. No man is supposed to call another man's wife. Okay, even when women call me that have husbands, I always suggest that they put their husband on the phone at the same time. It is disrespectful, it is wrong, and you will go to hell for that. Windwalker, you me approach? Owe me an apology. I listened to your punk ass voice message because you are wrong. You didn't call with respect, you're disrespectful. So as far as I'm concerned, Windwalker, you just like Brother Yasserala, and you just like Brother Whitehead. Until I see different. You want to make up? Call and say, I'm sorry. Until then, don't call me. Get yourself out the chat room. Goodbye. So anyways, all praise Most High people. We're going to keep on going with this lesson. Had to make that known public. Rap the news. Get on Windwalker. Peace and love.
The end of World War II was the effective start of a new war, which was termed the Cold War. This was a long standoff which at times manifested in proxy warfare between the two great superpowers of the United States and the Soviet Union. These two nations were allies during World War II and were both members of the United Nations, until the dissolution of the Soviet Union in 1991. The Cold War manifested itself in the Bay of Pigs, the Vietnam War, the space race, the Iran-Contra scandal, and other incidents and tensions. The Cold War lasted until 1991, which saw the fall of the Soviet communism. 2 years later, the European Union was formed. From Wikipedia, the Cold War was a state of geopolitical tension after World War II between powers in the Eastern Bloc, the Soviet Union and its satellite states, and powers in the Western Bloc, the United States, its NATO allies, and others. Historians do not fully agree on the dates, but a common time frame is the period between 1947, the year the Truman Doctrine was announced, and 1991, the year the Soviet Union collapsed. The term cold is used because there was no large-scale fighting directly between the two sides, although there were major regional wars known as proxy wars, supported by the two sides. The Cold War split the temporary wartime alliance against Nazi Germany, leaving the Soviet Union and the United States as two superpowers with profound economic and political differences. The nation of Italy was a political battleground during the Cold War. The two major Italian political parties from 1946 to 1991 were the Christian Democratic Party and the Communist Party. Each party was respectively funded and supported by the United States and the Soviet Union. From Wikipedia, there have been frequent government turnovers since 1945. Indeed, there have been 61 governments in this time. The dominance of the Christian Democratic Party during much of the post-war period lent continuity and comparative stability to Italy's political situation, mainly dominated by the attempt of keeping the Italian Communist Party out of power in order to maintain Cold War equilibrium in the region. Between 1945 and 1994, Italian politics was dominated by two major parties: Christian Democracy, the main party of government, and the Italian Communist Party, the main opposition party. During the time after World War II, when America was highly involved in rebuilding Europe, American culture and language spread very rapidly and profusely. American innovations, products, and ideas were widely diffused. In time, this tendency spread to many other nations around the world. This phenomenon is termed Americanization. The American dollar became the basis for trade, American Hollywood movies were known all over the world, and English became the second language across the globe. Coca-Cola and McDonald's became household names everywhere. Because of the American dollar becoming the international trade currency and English becoming the standard language across the globe, Aided by the United Nations and world governments, international trade began to flourish. The world was opening up to small national companies who could now find markets for their products almost anywhere in the world. From Wikipedia, in countries outside of the United States, Americanization is the influence American culture and business has on other countries, such as their media, cuisine, business practices, popular culture, technology, or political techniques. During the 15 years from 1950 to 1965, American investments in Europe soared by 800% to $13.9 billion, and in the European Economic Community rose 10 times to $6.25 billion. Europe's share of American investments increased from 15 to 28%. The investments were of very high visibility and generated much talk of Americanization. During this time period, inside the Catholic Church, a growing number of clergy and laymen were promoting and working towards modernizing the Catholic Church. Earlier, at the beginning of the 20th century, Pope St. Pius X fought against, wrote about, and warned of a revolutionary element that was inside the Church that wished to change the Church's teachings and liturgy. These were modernist Catholics, and they wanted to change the Church to conform to the modern world. An extreme example of the rejection of Christianity in the modern world is a trend that grew sometime after Vatican II to unbaptize oneself. One of the major themes of Vatican II was to bring the Church into the modern world. The idea was to take the Church out of her traditional position and to modernize the Church to have her conform to the modern world all around her. The modernists were opposed by traditional Catholics who wanted to keep the traditions, laws, liturgies, and beliefs of the Church from ages past. From Wikipedia, Vatican II addressed relations between the Catholic Church and the modern world. In the 1950s, theological and biblical studies in the Catholic Church had begun to sway away from the neo-scholasticism and biblical literalism, which a reaction to Catholic modernism had enforced since the First Vatican Council. This shift could be seen in theologians such as Karl Rahner, Michael Herbert, and John Courtney Murray, who looked to integrate modern human experience with church principles. John the 23rd often said that it was time to open the windows of the church and let in some fresh air. Pius X is known for vigorously opposing modernist interpretations of Catholic doctrine, promoting traditional devotional practices and orthodox theology. Traditionalist Catholics who claim that the modernizing reforms that resulted both directly and indirectly from the Council consequently brought detrimental effects, heretical acts, and indifference to the customs, beliefs, and pious practices of the Church before 1962. In addition, they say there is a doctrinal contradiction between the Council and earlier papal statements regarding faith, morals, and doctrine declared prior to the Council itself. In addition, they claim that the Council decentralized the previous notion of Catholic Church's supremacy over other religions while demoralizing its long-standing pious practices of religiosity.
So in other words, they demolished everybody's religion, made them combine with theirs. They also destroyed our whole heritage and gave us their religions and their heritage combined with everybody else's, making you do all of the devil's feast days and not the Creator. Okay? All praise to the Creator. Let's keep going on. This is showing you that they changed it. If you have some intelligence, you can see that they changed everything. You don't have your feast days. They took them from you on purpose. And they make you do theirs, which is all about Mr. J, Mr. Z, Reptilian Draco King, Snake King, Palladian King, Northern Light King. I can keep going for about an hour if you really want me to. We'll just keep going.
Vatican II was a council that was called by surprise by John the 23rd. It lasted from October of 1962 until November of 1965. After Vatican II, there was a great change that swept through the entire Catholic world. The beautiful, ornate decorations and religious art in Catholic churches were taken down and destroyed in the majority of the churches. The altar rails were removed and tabernacles were moved off to the side or to remote places in the church. Modern art and abstract statues, paintings, and stained glass windows were put up in many Catholic churches. Very often, the ornate and gilded sacred vessels, which were made of precious metal, were replaced by oblique and modern cups, often made of ceramic, wood, or glass. Traditional Catholic music was replaced by new modern hymns. From Wikipedia, Recovation is a portmanteau term coined by some Catholics to describe the controversial style of renovations which historic Catholic cathedrals, churches, and oratories have undergone since the Second Vatican Council. Church renovations started in the late 1960s, but gained momentum with the publication of the aforementioned document. Examples of typical changes seen in the renovations include the removal of the high altar, side altars, altar rails, religious artwork, statues of the saints, elevated pulpits, and non-face-to-face confessionals. In some cases, the sanctuary was extended into the nave, which would reduce available seating for the congregation and modify the original architect's vision for line of sight and symmetry. Seating for the laity was occasionally placed in the apse or old sanctuary to create a theater in the round concept. Reredos and altar screens were removed, leaving the sanctuary walls bare, which left historic churches without a central focus. Perhaps most controversially, in many renovated churches, the tabernacle was removed from the sanctuary and placed in a less prominent part of the church, such as the side altar or even a separate room. These changes in church architecture and design have been criticized from an artistic standpoint. Many historical and irreplaceable works of art have been discarded or destroyed during these renovations. The end results of many renovations have also been criticized as unattractive and not an improvement from the preconciliar designs. Opponents of Recovation also charge that such changes to churches are iconoclastic and result in Catholic churches that look more like theaters, airport terminals, or barns rather than churches. A major concern is that the design of renovated churches downplays the sense of the sacred in favor of focus on the congregation. Critics see this as inconsistent with the traditional Catholic understanding of communal worship. Meanwhile, more liberal Catholics have referred to the renovations as necessary steps in order to emphasize the role of the congregation in worship, in accord with the wishes of Vatican II.
Hold on, y'all heard that? According with the wishes of Vatican II. The Vatican also had a hand with the Pope changing the holy days, which you call feast day, because it wasn't called the Sabbath. Sabbath stands for Satan. I rebuke that name. And they gave you the Sabbath days and took away all your shit. So what are you really doing when you go by the moon? That's what they did. The Mayans did it when they were worshiping the Dragon King, the Snake King, the Draco King. So what are you really doing? When you go by the Saturday, Friday, or Sunday Sabbath, any other so-called Sabbath, right? What are you really doing? You're doing their shit. You're not doing our shit. The Victor wrote the story, man. You have to go get our history, look up our real history. You got to go deep. And that's what y'all ain't doing. This is why you simply don't know. You're not buying all the books. I have 28 books. I'm going to send out 18 books today, plus all the video footage, plus all the evidence of what we're going over right now. Older books. Huh? First century books. Oh, yeah. Y'all better wake up. Buy older books. If you're not going deep, you really at this point, at this far in the game, you don't really have no business teaching. I'm just gonna be honest. I'm seeing too many errors with people in that King James Version Bible. I'm sorry, but the truth is the truth. You want to teach from that? Only teach the stuff that is true. Stay away from the falsehood stuff. That Bible is a stone book for our people.
On April 3rd, 1969, Paul VI signed and promulgated the Novus Ordo. However, around this time, it wasn't just the Mass that was changed, but liturgies of all the 7 sacraments that were altered. The term Novus Ordo means new order and was a striking departure from the traditional Catholic Mass that goes back at least as far as Pope St. Gregory the Great in the 6th century. This new order wasn't said on the traditional Catholic altar, which was in every pre-Vatican II church, but instead a second and new altar was erected in every church. It was on this altar that the Novus Ordo was said. Eventually, after the promulgation of Novus Ordo, new modern churches began to be constructed across the world. These new modern churches were specifically designed for Novus Ordo, since they were constructed without altar rails, with modern art and design, and without the traditional Catholic altar. These new modern churches typically were built in Greek amphitheater design. After Vatican II and Novus Ordo, a great confusion spread over the whole church. And after Vatican II and the promulgation of Novus Ordo also, women thrust themselves onto the altar as lectors, extraordinary ministers, and altar servers. Although Paul VI signed and officially created the Novus Ordo on April 3, 1969, it did not become mandatory until November 28, 1971. During the interim, the Vatican was working on revised translations, since the Novus Ordo could be said in vernacular languages instead of the liturgical language of Latin. Priests were still allowed to say traditional Latin Mass after April 3, 1969, but this option effectively ceased by November 28, 1971, at which point priests now had to say the Novus Ordo. Interestingly, the date of November 28, 1971 coincides almost exactly with the 15th day of Kislev on a Jewish calendar. In fact, the closest Sunday to the 15th of Kislev, without going past the date, is November 28, 1971. The 15th of Kislev is the date that Antiochus puts the abomination of desolation on the altar in the Old Testament. Here is an article written concerning the October 1969 instruction concerning the new rite. The website link to this article will be included in the description.
Okay, we're going to make another one. Be back in a minute.